Growing up, I dreamt of becoming a shark scientist, and I worked my ass off to earn a scholarship to one of the top collegiate marine biology programs in the United States. In fact, all of the shark photos in this presentation are ones that I took during my diving adventures. But like many professionals tuning in today, my career path includes a few unexpected loop-de-loops, and I somehow stumbled into a long-term relationship with security and privacy. And to this day, I find lessons from shark science and conservation to be particularly relevant for security and privacy. And this is because they share a number of critical characteristics. The first is that incidents in both fields tend to be emotional. Second, the risks will never be zero, despite our best efforts and our best defenses, and even the benefits of engagement. Third, the public is often ill-informed and scared of the topic in general. And fourth, science-based policy, unfortunately, is not the norm. I've now spent most of my career helping security and privacy practitioners proactively think through their style and mode of communication in order to optimize the type and quality of possible outcomes available to them. Improving outcomes such as secure development adoption, representative and inclusive policies, and user education. But not all potential outcomes are possible, depending on your approach and how you execute your strategy. And so the goal from a communications perspective is to ensure the availability of the outcomes you want before you try to pursue them. Now, generally speaking, organizations can do this by constantly evaluating and measuring their communication goals, and in order to secure and seize the specific opportunities they need. However, over the last several years, I've become increasingly troubled by a communications phenomenon present among leadership who oversee security and privacy in both the public and private sectors. And that is the use of crisis as a governing strategy. Too many institutions, from governments to businesses, have become addicted to the manipulation of fear among the people we claim to protect. Now, governing by crisis is different from crisis management, which is merely the way that we respond and mitigate unexpected circumstances or events. Governing by crisis has a few very distinct characteristics. First, it may seem like policies change all the time, by the hour, the day, or the week. It's like policy whiplash. Second, everyday blunders routinely escalate into crisis before they're remediated. Things that really shouldn't become a crisis easily become one because they are mishandled. Third, taking advantage of public anxiety for something to be done now, just to push an action that protects your own self-interests, is a good indicator that you are tapping into governing by crisis. And finally, emotionality is used in an attempt to control the process and protect the powerful. Now, I've introduced this term emotionality. So what exactly does it mean? Generally speaking, emotionality refers to how we experience and express emotions. It's a natural part of being human and can be expressed in as many different ways as there are different people. However, when this particular aspect of human nature is exploited, it can become a threat to effective communications as well as effective incident response. In both politics and business, emotions never stand in isolation. In fact, they're a manifestation of the biases and influences that we have that enable the distribution of emotional expression to certain groups on certain issues and at certain times. Emotionality in governing, whether in politics or corporate setting, provides a framework for understanding the central question of who gets what, when they get it, and how they will get it. The practice of emotionality is where I'm going to focus my remarks today, because it's something every one of us can learn to identify, call out, and eradicate from our communications response following an incident, especially when we're engaging with government agencies, business leaders, or consumers. Now, before I go too far down the path of emotionality, I do want to say a few things about fear. And that's because a lot of people are afraid of sharks, although there are certainly cultures where sharks are revered or worshipped. But in places where fear is the predominant public reaction to sharks, it's really difficult for scientists and conservationists to convince governments to pass good policies that protect the marine environment. And we see the same challenge and struggles in passing good policy for security and privacy. And this is because public fear puts pressure on leaders not only to react, but to react immediately. And that often leads to knee-jerk reactions and short-sighted policy decisions. As security and privacy professionals, we need to acknowledge but responsibly educate people about the risks without inciting panic. I know it's easier said than done, but it's critical that we build this skill as a standard expectation throughout our industry, because fear also impacts learning and information retention in the human brain. It is common for emotional events like shark bites or security incidents to cause people to feel afraid. And this matters because it's a natural response from the amygdala in our hindbrain, which prepares us for fight or flight. It increases the flow of adrenaline and oxygen-rich blood to our muscles, which is why our heart rate increases, but it also closes off connections to our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain responsible for complex problem solving and judgment. It's why we train first responders and incident response teams over and over again on protocols and procedures, because in a crisis, they will need to override the instincts of their hindbrain. I was first introduced to the term emotionality through the work of Dr. Christopher Pepinneff, a senior lecturer in public policy at the University of Sydney. Dr. Pepineff's work looks at emotionality in the context of shark bites to create room for a greater critique of emotional taxation, placebo politics, policies as therapy, and knee-jerk reactions. Some of his recent findings can be found in his book Flaws, which was published in 2019, and I highly recommend it. Dr. Pepinneff applies the concept of emotionality within the context of government and public responses to various shark bites throughout history. In his research, Dr. Pepinneff found that following shark bites, political actors often select policy responses that are designed to appear as an attempt to relieve anxiety and boost confidence in themselves, but actually do very little to address the underlying risk. Now, of course, this conclusion piqued my security communications spidey sense. Dr. Pepinneff remarks that when sharks bite humans, governments and policymakers fear a public outcry and emotions are pitted against evidence-based policymaking. He mentions in his book two specific troublesome examples that I want to discuss today. One is Western Australia's lethal control program, and the second is the political and media frenzy of Florida's infamous Summer of the Shark. Keep in mind as I go through each of these examples that in the aftermath of an incident, particularly those that are influenced by media attention, external pressure increases for leaders to act immediately, and this is for better or worse. Western Australia operates one of the longest running lethal shark control programs in the world. In 2012, it implemented a serious and imminent threat policy in order to justify hunting, catching, and killing sharks preemptively, simply for swimming near beaches. And then 12 months later, had to change the criteria to be merely a serious threat after a government review found that the policy created false expectations and in most cases would result in failure. According to the review, the criteria of an imminent threat was problematic because it made inaction possible and opened the government up to criticism. Additionally, scientific research continues to show that these lethal efforts are not only ineffective at preventing shark bites, they're having a negative impact on other marine creatures and habitats. Moreover, the continued use of these policies has resulted in a public backlash because the government's position is perceived as a reaction against people who support sharks, and the public debate has increased their visibility and resistance. The sensationalized Summer of the Shark was invented by US media in July of 2001, and it continued for months, despite no evidence of an actual increase in shark bites. And it continued until the terrorist attacks of September 11th, which effectively took over the news cycle. So despite both an overall shark bites and fatal bites being down from the previous year, the media was successful in creating a moment of hype and political frenzy. And we see similar responses from government, industry, and media in the context of security and privacy. One example is the ongoing debate between strong end-to-end encryption and national security. The entitlement of law enforcement to explore every possible investigation method they can possibly imagine is a familiar pain point for our community. Most obviously, because many government agencies are loyal and intentional subscribers of Emotionality and use it without shame to capitalize on public emotions following incidents in order to push their agenda forward under the perception of taking firm and immediate action in response to an event. After each attack in San Bernardino, London, and Paris, law enforcement again called for backdoor access to encrypted messages, even as we learned about the early warning signs they ignored. The constant call for weakened encryption is an attempt to relieve anxiety and boost public confidence in these agencies by demonstrating action, but it actually does little to address the underlying political, economic, or cultural motivations that cause these attacks in the first place. So why do agencies keep up the facade? Especially when from a communications perspective, they would be far more effective to start with rebuilding public trust in the institutions and laws that govern the use of data for national security, by putting safeguards in place first before asking the public to issue a blank check against our privacy and human rights. Not just in the words and policies, but in practice and with consistency. In essence, they're not doing this just for the sake of public appearance, but because crisis is actually how these agencies govern. It's how they move from one moment to the next. The most momentum they may ever have, because otherwise they don't know how to get it, is immediately following an incident, especially if they can incite fear and panic. Responding to and inciting crisis is how many of these agencies and political players move their policies, agendas, and ambitions forward. The second example is data breaches and privacy enforcement. Data breach and privacy enforcements are some of my favorite Emotionality examples because they're among the most predictable. Outraged media statements from politicians based on limited information, followed by demands for ongoing, never-ending congressional hearings that are actually used in practice to grandstand any number of unrelated pet projects, and then followed by a settlement or legal judgment that, while very well-intentioned and often deserved, still does very little to address the underlying forces at play. We don't hear about every shark bite in the world, just like we don't hear about every security or privacy incident in the world. There are a number of reasons for this, involving both media and policy agendas. But the issue I want to raise here is the use of Emotionality to label incidents and take political action according to whose agenda needs a crisis today. Remember that exploiting Emotionality is an attempt to manipulate the situation in order to benefit the powerful. This is not to mean that there shouldn't be enforcement following incidents that cause harm to consumers. Of course there should. But when those with a financial interest use emotionality to gain influence and attention following someone else's failure, we justifiably call that ambulance chasing. Yet for some reason, we allow politicians and even sometimes our bosses to get away with it. Leaders are eager to issue statements and propose performative legislation to capitalize on media frenzies, while well-funded VC-backed startups that collect personal information like financial or location data aren't even required to do the bare minimum of deploying multi-factor authentication, scanning for credential dumps, or notifying users of unexpected logins. The similar red flags present in the way organizations respond to shark bites and security incidents are concerning. The first similarity is the militaristic style of many government and vendor responses. From as early as World War II, we've seen governments around the world deploy military force as part of their public response to shark bites. And that is starting to happen in security as well. However, armies are not shark whisperers, but they do demonstrate power on behalf of the government. It's security theater and reflects a lack of appropriate subject matter expertise as well as intellectual integrity. Remember, people in power are tapping emotionality when they want to exercise control or hide underlying motivation. The second consideration is salience, or the speed of political attention, which is often driven by media narratives. Dr. Neff found a strong correlation between the use of the term shark attack in press stories and the parts of the world that experienced public panic regardless of the facts surrounding the incident. This public panic in turn drove worse policy outcomes because politicians felt more pressure to act quickly with actions that didn't necessarily address the underlying issues. But the problem isn't always the shark bites themselves, but the media attention that directs political attention to specific events while ignoring others. There are always shark bites and security events that receive little to no attention from the press or politicians. Some cases count, while others don't. And the decision as to which is often based on which stories sell. Ultimately, we end up time after time with a core of government and industry leaders falling back on the age-old crutch of political emotionality. Unfortunately, political emotionality, whether from public or private sector, following a security incident, often leads to perception narrowing and ineffective enforcements. Perception narrowing is when we're unable to notice or deal with subtle aspects of a situation because we're fixated on a single element. What these examples of shark bite and security incident response show us is an overdependence by governments and industry to govern by crisis. And when we consider the long-term implications for our industry, our profession, and consumer security as a whole, this approach could not be further from best practice. It's a series of knee-jerk reactions designed to protect the powerful and control everyone else. So what would a successful communications approach look like in the aftermath of an incident? In 2005, Cape Town, South Africa started a Sharkspotter program after a series of great white shark bites in the area. Local stakeholders, shark conservationists, and community members organized to do something before politicians stepped in with a knee-jerk reaction. Their approach was to proactively reduce the interaction and conflict between beachgoers and sharks with an early warning service provided at strategic beaches in the area. Now, a lot of the characteristics of their program are things that would play well in security and privacy responses as well. First is it was proactive. They weren't just waiting for something bad to happen in order to catch a moment of momentum. Second is it was community-based and involved a plethora of stakeholders. Third, they really built a public service. They provided early warning signs for the public. Fourth, they provided access to the public of both current and historical information. So the public was as informed as they possibly could be. Fourth, they were really focused on reducing dangerous interactions. They weren't just witch hunting after the fact. And lastly, it was focused on strategic locations and specific species of sharks. They weren't casting a wide net, imagining that every risk and every threat was the same. And to this day, the Sharkspotter program in Cape Town stands as one of the best programs in the world. I believe their proactive and community-focused approach could also be adopted by our industries to get ahead of knee-jerk political responses and help advance the state of our own organizations beyond governing by crisis. Unlike the lethal control programs in Western Australia or the ongoing encryption drama and data breach frenzies, it was individuals, not the government, in Cape Town who came together to design and implement a solution that protected their communities and led to real results. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.